Before we talk about what happened inside that Las Vegas pawn shop, consider this for a moment. How many objects disappear from history, not because they were destroyed, but because someone wanted the world to forget they ever existed? Empires rise, kingdoms fall, families vanish, and sometimes the only witness left behind is an object that survives centuries in complete silence. Every scratch becomes a sentence. Every missing document becomes another unanswered question. And every so often, one of those forgotten relics resurfaces in the most unexpected place imaginable. In the spring of 2019, customers walked into the famous gold and silver pawn shop expecting to see the usual collection of vintage coins, antique firearms, rare guitars, and historical memorabilia. Instead, something entirely different entered through the front door. It wasn't carried by museum curators, government officials, or billionaire collectors. It arrived with a quiet man who introduced himself only as Thomas. There was nothing extraordinary about him. He wasn't dressed like someone transporting one of the world's most valuable historical artifacts. He didn't arrive with security guards or lawyers. He didn't announce himself or demand special treatment. In fact, if you had passed him in the parking lot, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. But the wooden crate he carefully placed on the counter told an entirely different story. It wasn't an ordinary shipping box. Time itself seemed to cling to its surface. Layers of dark lacquer had hardened over decades, while faded red silk cords wrapped around the crate with deliberate precision. Even before anyone removed the lid, experienced staff members sensed they were looking at something unlike anything they normally handled. At Gold and Silver Pawn, thousands of valuable items pass through every year. Most arrive after phone calls, scheduled appointments, or recommendations from collectors. Truly significant artifacts rarely appear without warning. This one did, and from the moment Thomas stepped inside, everything changed. Stay with us, because what looked like an ordinary appraisal would soon become one of the strangest mysteries ever connected to Pawn Stars. When the crate was finally opened, several senior staff members had already gathered around the counter. That detail alone spoke volumes. High-value evaluations usually involve additional witnesses, but only when someone believes an item could be worth hundreds of thousands or more. Nobody expected what they were about to see. Inside rested a complete Japanese samurai armor. Not just any armor. This was an oyoroi, one of the oldest and most prestigious forms of armor ever created during feudal Japan. Built for powerful military commanders rather than ordinary soldiers, every section reflected astonishing craftsmanship. Hundreds of lacquered iron plates overlapped with mathematical precision, connected by intricate silk lacing dyed in deep indigo blue. The helmet carried elaborate decorative features, while the face mask was designed to project authority as much as protection. Even after centuries, the craftsmanship remained breathtaking. It wasn't simply armor. It was history made visible. For several moments, conversation almost stopped. Rick Harrison had spent decades evaluating priceless collectibles. From handwritten presidential documents to centuries-old weapons and million-dollar artifacts, very little surprised him anymore. Yet even he paused, because objects like this don't usually appear inside neighborhood pawn shops. Thomas calmly explained that the armor had belonged to his family since the end of the Second World War. According to family tradition, a relative serving with the American military during Japan's post-war occupation had acquired it sometime during the late 1940s. Since then, it had remained stored away, largely untouched, passed quietly from one generation to the next. No museum exhibitions, no auction appearances, no public records, just an old family story. That explanation raised immediate questions. Collectors typically preserve paperwork for artifacts of enormous historical value. Bills of sale, export licenses, military transfer documents, photographs, anything establishing a clear chain of ownership. Thomas had almost none of it. Instead, he presented only family history and one remarkable claim. He believed the armor was worth $100 million. Inside almost every pawn negotiation, there's usually a moment when the seller names a price that surprises everyone in the room. This wasn't one of those moments. This was something entirely different. $100 million wasn't simply ambitious. It sounded impossible. Even Rick struggled to hide his reaction. Still, extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary investigation. Rather than dismissing Thomas outright, the team began examining every visible detail with increasing care. The longer they looked, the stranger the story became. Experts noted the distinctive silk construction. The lacquer appeared consistent with authentic 16th-century techniques. The iron plates showed centuries of natural aging impossible to fake convincingly. Every feature suggested remarkable authenticity. But one tiny detail drew far more attention than everything else combined. Hidden inside the chest plate sat a small engraved family crest. At first glance, it looked almost insignificant. Many historical suits of armor carried clan symbols identifying their owners. Most represented famous Japanese families with extensive historical records. This one didn't. One expert studying the symbol suddenly became noticeably quieter. Instead of discussing craftsmanship, he focused entirely on the crest. Something about it felt wrong. Or perhaps more accurately, impossible. What he believed he recognized wasn't merely the emblem of an old samurai family. It belonged to a bloodline historians believed had vanished more than 4 centuries earlier. If his identification proved correct, the armor wasn't simply rare. It was unique, and uniqueness changes everything. Because once an artifact becomes historically irreplaceable, its value is no longer determined by collectors alone. Governments become interested. Museums become involved. International laws suddenly matter far more than money. Without realizing it, Thomas had potentially carried one of Japan's most important missing historical treasures into an American pawn shop. Imagine discovering that something sitting quietly in your attic wasn't just valuable, but possibly belonged to the history of an entire nation. What would you do? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Over the following hours, specialists examined photographs, historical references, construction techniques, and manufacturing details. Every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. The silk matched production methods from Japan's violent Sengoku period. The armor's design reflected ceremonial status rather than ordinary battlefield equipment. The craftsmanship suggested it had likely belonged to someone occupying the highest levels of feudal society. Yet the greatest mystery remained that tiny engraved crest. Its appearance contradicted centuries of accepted history. If historians were correct, the family connected to that symbol had been systematically erased after one of Japan's bloodiest conflicts. Their estates confiscated. Their descendants hunted. Their legacy deliberately removed from official records. Very few objects connected to that lineage were ever supposed to survive. Certainly not one sitting under bright television studio lights in Las Vegas. Rick Harrison realized this was no longer a routine negotiation. It had become an investigation, one that would soon pull historians, legal experts, cultural authorities, and international institutions into a mystery stretching back more than 400 years. And before anyone could discuss buying or selling the armor, they first had to answer a much bigger question. How had it escaped history in the first place? The answer wouldn't be found inside the pawn shop. It would be buried beneath 4 centuries of war, betrayal, and one of the most ruthless campaigns of political erasure in Japanese history. Within days of Thomas's visit, Rick Harrison reached out to specialists who spent their entire careers studying feudal Japan. Authenticating an object worth thousands is difficult enough. Authenticating one that could potentially rewrite historical records is something else entirely. One of the first experts to examine the armor was a respected scholar of Japanese material culture, whose decades of research had taken him from museum archives to archaeological excavations across Japan. Unlike television audiences, he wasn't interested in the price tag. He wanted answers. As the armor was carefully inspected piece by piece, his confidence in its authenticity only grew stronger. The lacquer showed the slow aging patterns expected from centuries of natural oxidation. The silk lacing reflected weaving methods almost impossible to reproduce using modern techniques. Even the tiny imperfections in the iron plates matched manufacturing practices from Japan's Sengoku period, a century defined by endless civil war, shifting alliances, and ambitious warlords fighting to unite the country. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. This wasn't an imitation. It wasn't a 19th century reproduction. And it certainly wasn't a movie prop. It was real. But authenticity was no longer the biggest story. The crest engraved inside the chest plate had become the center of everyone's attention. For most people, it looked like nothing more than an elegant decorative symbol. To historians, it represented something almost unthinkable. The emblem appeared connected to a branch of the Toyotomi family. That name alone carries enormous weight in Japanese history. The Toyotomi clan helped shape an entire nation during one of its most turbulent eras. Under the leadership of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Japan moved closer to political unification than ever before. Castles rose across the landscape. Rival warlords submitted. Decades of constant warfare slowly gave way to order. But power has a way of attracting enemies. After Hideyoshi's death, everything began to unravel. Another powerful leader, Tokugawa Ieyasu, challenged the Toyotomi family's remaining influence. Years of political maneuvering eventually erupted into open conflict, culminating in one devastating event: the Siege of Osaka. For months, enormous armies surrounded Osaka Castle, determined to eliminate the last meaningful resistance against Tokugawa's growing rule. The final assault became one of the defining moments in Japanese history. When the fighting ended in 1615, victory belonged to Tokugawa. The consequences were absolute. Entire branches of the Toyotomi family disappeared forever. Lands were confiscated. Supporters were executed. Records were rewritten. Anything capable of preserving the family's legacy was systematically removed whenever possible. History wasn't simply changing. It was being edited. Imagine trying to erase an entire family today. Not only removing the people themselves, but destroying photographs, legal records, letters, monuments, even their names from official documents. That's the scale historians believe unfolded after Osaka, which is precisely why the crest inside Thomas's armor created such shock. Objects connected directly to that erased bloodline are extraordinarily rare. Many scholars believed some branches had left nothing behind at all. Yet here sat a complete ceremonial suit of armor bearing their emblem. It was as though history had suddenly whispered, "I survived." If you're fascinated by mysteries where history refuses to stay buried, consider subscribing. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't made by archaeologists, but by ordinary people opening forgotten boxes. As remarkable as the historical implications were, an even larger problem began taking shape. Ownership. Finding ancient treasure is exciting. Proving you legally own it is something entirely different. The armor's documented history contained an enormous gap. Experts could trace similar artifacts back to noble collections in Japan before the early 20th century. Then, nothing. Nearly a century disappeared from the historical record. No verified transfers. No museum inventories. No export licenses. No customs declarations. Simply vanished. Thomas's family story resumed sometime after the Second World War, when an American military officer allegedly acquired the armor during the Allied occupation of Japan. But one word in the surviving paperwork immediately troubled legal specialists. The letter described the armor as acquired, not purchased, not inherited, not donated, acquired. That single word carried enormous consequences. Following World War II, millions of cultural objects changed hands throughout Europe and Asia. Some were legally transferred. Others were recovered from abandoned estates. Many disappeared during the confusion that follows every major conflict. Even today, museums across the world continue returning